Good day, economic students. This is Chick Kelly. Welcome to another video of review basic economic principles and concepts. The purpose of this particular video is to analyze and examine markets and to investigate the tools of supply and demand as economic concepts and principles used to make sense of markets. What is a market? A market is an institution which brings together buyers and sellers. For our purpose, we said there are a large number of buyers and a very large number of sellers because we want the markets to reflect situations where it is the interaction of buyers and sellers which bring us to what economists call equilibrium. There are three types of markets most important to this particular course. Product markets, which are simply products and services. Households are the buyers in those markets. Businesses are the sellers. So households are the downward sloping demand curve. Businesses would be the upward sloping supply curve. Resource markets, land, capital, labor. Things have flip-flopped in the resource markets. Remember, in a system of capitalism, households ultimately own all of the economic resources. Therefore, households are the sellers or the suppliers of the resources. And the demanders are the businesses. The businesses are buying resources in the resource markets. The last type of market, which we will not investigate in any detail in this video, is the currency markets. The currency markets are important because we need to have some understanding how changing the price of one currency in terms of another currency, a currency appreciating or depreciating, will impact international trade, but that is for another time. This generic run-of-the-mill supply and demand graph can be used to analyze any markets. So make certain you remember that price is measured on the vertical axis. Quantity is measured on the horizontal axis. Also, it is vitally important to remember economists use the tools of supply and demand to determine what is the equilibrium price and quantity in the market. Ultimately, that is the chief purpose of this exercise, is to determine what happens to price and quantity. So this will be our stepping stone, this particular graph, for all markets analyzed. We will assume that we are at an equilibrium price and quantity, a temporary resting place. This is the beginning, not the end of the analysis. How did we get to equilibrium? The McConnell textbook calls it the rationing function of prices. And Adam Smith calls it the invisible hand. The same idea explained in two different terms. Buyers are attempting to maximize utility. Sellers are trying to maximize profit. As if led by an invisible hand, the rationing function of prices brings us to equilibrium, and we assume this is the most efficient outcome in competitive markets. After we have a basic understanding of what a market is and how supply and demand are tools to analyze markets, it is vitally important to understand the 5 non-price determinants of demand and the 6 non-price determinants of supply as shifters or non-price determinants to figure out what happens in market when something other than price changes. On the demand side of the equation, we identified 5 of these non-price determinants of demand: taste and preferences, number of buyers, price of related goods, and that is both substitutes and complements. Buyer's income, just be careful, remember the difference between normal goods and inferior goods. And finally, expectations. Expectations about future product price, expectations about future product availability, and expectations about future income. The top 2 graphs on this slide demonstrate what happens to equilibrium when there is either an increase or decrease in demand. Remember, you are always going to identify what market you are analyzing, identify which non-price determinant of supply or demand is affected, and then comment on the results of how the change in demand or change in supply affects equilibrium price or quantity. So in the upper left-hand corner, you can see any increase in demand, a shift from D1 to D2, a rightward shift of the curve, would end up with a result of an increase in price and an increase in quantity in that particular market. For our purposes, we could say this could be caused by an increase in the taste and preferences for the product or service, an increase in the number of buyers, an increase in the price of a substitute, a decrease in the price of a complement. So review those non-price determinants. Extremely important to understand that. Upper right-hand corner demonstrates how a decrease in demand will ultimately affect equilibrium price and quantity in the market. A decrease in demand will end up with a result of a lower equilibrium price and a lower quantity purchased and sold in this market. Down bottom we have the supply shifters. Bottom left demonstrates an increase in supply. Bottom right demonstrates a decrease in supply. The four most important non-price determinants of demand: resources, also called factors of production, also called inputs. If there's a change in the price that any business has to pay to acquire resources, that's ultimately going to either increase or decrease supply. Number of sellers. If sellers enter a market, that would increase supply. If sellers leave a market, that would decrease supply. Taxes and subsidies. Any decrease on taxes to producers increases supply. Any increase decreases supply. And think of subsidies as taxes in reverse. And last non-price determinant of supply, which is typically important for us to analyze in addition to number of sellers, resource prices, taxes and subsidies, is technology. Any improvement in the technological aspect of producing a product or service would increase supply. Any decrease in technology or temporary disruption of technology would decrease supply. The other two non-price determinants, price of other goods or expectations about prices, something we didn't spend too much time on, but they could ultimately impact supply. Let's spend the rest of this video analyzing the review questions that you were supposed to spend some time with this week in preparation for the quiz. The first question asks about the plastic toy market, and it says in the problem that there's a significant rise in the price of polymers. Polymers are used to make plastics. So how will this affect the market for toys? Okay, any manufacturer of any toy involving plastic needs to purchase polymer. Therefore, it is an economic resource or factor of production. Let's assume this graph represents equilibrium before the increase in the price of the economic resource. E1 represents equilibrium today, a certain price for these toys, certain quantity purchased and sold. And then all of the participants in the market have to deal with this new event. An increase in the price of a resource will affect supply. It will decrease supply. Any increase in the price of a factor of production or economic input. A leftward shift in supply will ultimately decrease equilibrium quantity and increase equilibrium price. Notice that we have done three important things with this problem. We identified the market up top, plastic toy markets. We identified the non-price determinant of supply or demand, in this case, non-price determinant of supply, an increase in the price of a resource, one of the 6 non-price determinants of supply. How did this affect the market? It decreased supply. And then we clearly labeled our results. The results of the decrease in supply, price up, quantity down in the market for plastic toys. Problem number 2 deals with the market for copper piping, the copper piping market. In the problem, it tells you that both new construction and remodeling projects determine that PEX, plastic piping, is less expensive and easier to install than the old copper piping. Years ago, both in commercial and residential construction, copper was pretty much the only option for installing pipes in the walls to deal with all the water, whether it was bringing water to the sink of the tub or draining water out of the house or the building. PEX has pretty much replaced the use of copper in most construction. So, if the price of PEX decreases, how will that affect the market for copper piping? In terms of supply and demand, we can identify PEX as a substitute for copper. In this case, the price of a substitute has decreased. There's a decrease in the price of a substitute. How will it affect the market for copper piping? As always, we start off by drawing a supply and demand graph, labeling price and quantity properly, identifying equilibrium to begin, and saying, okay, today, or yesterday, I should say, before any introduction of PEX, any decrease in the price of a substitute, in the copper pipe market, there was equilibrium 1 at P1Q1. Now something has changed. All of a sudden, there is a decrease in the price of the substitutes. If there's a decrease in the price of the substitute for copper piping, there will be a decrease in the demand for copper piping. What will be the result of this decrease in demand? Quantity will decrease and price will decrease. So again, we identified the market, copper piping markets. We made certain to identify which non-price determinant of supply and demand affected the market. In this case, the decrease in the price of the substitutes. That ultimately shifted the demand curve leftward from D1 to D2. And the result of the leftward shift or decrease in demand is a price down, quantity down in the market for copper piping. Question number 3, mall. Lots of space in these malls. If you get a chance, watch the original Blues Brothers, a funny movie. Okay, what's going on in the mall space? Consumers decide shopping on Amazon and other online retailers is far more convenient and practical than traditional shopping at brick and mortar stores. I don't know who ever spends time at stores anymore when you can simply click and wait for your good or service to be delivered, and it's going to be even faster now. So how will these events affect the market for rents charged by owners of shopping malls and strip malls? So in this case, we're looking at the market for a resource, a land resource. Who are the buyers? The buyers are the owners of stores. The owners of the stores are ultimately purchasing this land resource. Who are the sellers? The sellers are whatever company, corporation, or individual owns the strip mall or the shopping mall. As always, we start off by identifying the market under consideration. This is mall space rental. That's the market for mall space rental. We have suppliers and demanders. Think of price in this particular market as how much is charged per month per square foot of rental space. And quantity will be the quantity of square footage of rental space purchased at shopping malls. Before Amazon and other retailers disrupted the market, the situation existed as pictured on the board, E1, P1, Q1. Now, something has changed. There will be a decrease in the number of buyers for brick and mortar stores. Stores will either close altogether their brick and mortar, their physical operations, or they will simply have fewer stores available at malls across the country. This decrease in the number of buyers, the non-price determinant of demand, will shift the demand curve to the left. A decrease in demand will ultimately impact equilibrium, and the result, a lower equilibrium quantity of square footage purchased at a lower price. So let's talk about how this particular real-world event is something that you could learn from, and you could analyze, and you could actually profit from as someone who has studied economics. Economic events create secondary effects. What are the secondary effects of the retail market being completely shaken up and overwhelmed by this avalanche of Amazon and other retailers, other online retailers? Well, the first group of participants impacted are the retailers themselves. If you look at the big box retailers, Sears, Macy's, JCPenney's, they have been crushed by Amazon. And if you look at their stock prices, it resonates how much they have been crushed. Some of their stocks are down 80, 90% from their highs 5 years ago. So if you think about how can I use this economic education I'm getting here at St. Joe's University to learn something about what's going on in the world, well, you could have got ahead of this and shorted the companies who were highly exposed to brick and mortar stores for their profits. The other participants who are going to be negatively impacted this are the owners of strip malls. Right in front of you, the supply and demand curve demonstrates the price or the rent received by these owners is down and there's fewer space rented. So look for companies who make their profit by buying and renting mall space, whether it's a tiny mall or a giant mall like the King of Prussia Mall. There's other good companies you could short and make profit from your economic knowledge. Everybody loves pizza markets. So this problem tells us that pizza grows in popularity among Americans. At the same time, there's an increase in the price of mozzarella cheese. This is the first problem we analyze where there are two events happening simultaneously, one affecting demand and one affecting supply. And the question asks, how will these two events ultimately affect the market for pizza? If you remember from our study in class, whenever there is an event affecting supply and an event affecting demand simultaneously in the markets, there will be one of our two variables, either price or quantity, will have an indeterminate result. Here's the pizza market before the two events. Price 1, quantity 1, at equilibrium 1. Let's analyze each event separately. First, there's an increase in the taste and preference for pizza, one of the non-price determinants of demand. That will shift the demand curve to the right. An increase in demand will ultimately drive up equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. If this were the only event impacting the market, it would be over. The problem would be finished and analyzed. Increase in preferences, increases demand, results, price up, quantity up, easy peasy, and you're all finished. However, at the same time, there's an increase in the price of mozzarella. What happens in the market for pizza when all producers have to pay a higher price for an economic input, a resource? Increase in the resource price ultimately drives up price in the market for pizzas because there's a leftward shift in the supply curve and ultimately decreases equilibrium quantity. So on the right, you see the non-price determinant of supply, in this case, an increase in the price of resource, decreases supply, results price up, quantity down. What is the ultimate results because of the two events happening simultaneously? Well, the increase in demand drove up price and drove quantity up. The decrease in supply drove up price but drove quantity down. Therefore, the final results in the pizza market, and you need to identify these clearly, final results: decrease in supply, increase in demand, price definitely increases, quantity indeterminate. Now, what does indeterminate mean? It means quantity could have gone up a bit, it could have gone down a bit, it could be the exact same. We just do not know because we don't know the magnitude of the shifts. Was there a huge decrease in supply and only a small increase in demand, or vice versa? For this reason, you need to draw these two events on separate graphs. Whenever you're handed a problem to analyze of a market and there's one event impacting supply and another event affecting demand, draw two separate graphs, analyze each separately, and come up with your results, and you will never do it incorrectly. Just remember that either price or quantity will always have an indeterminate result if you have a situation where two events are simultaneously affecting the market, one for supply and one for demand. Solar energy, another problem involving two shifts. Large number of manufacturing firms businesses, households install solar panels. So businesses are looking for ways to cut their energy costs. So they start installing solar panels. A lot of individuals, households are also going this new wave clean energy path. They're installing solar panels. At the same time, electrical engineers introduce significant technological advancements in the production of solar panels. How will these two events affect the market for solar energy? So the market here is for solar energy. Some students mistakenly identified it as solar panels. How will these affect the market for solar energy? Let's assume this is the equilibrium for solar energy prior to the two events. Price 1, quantity 1 at equilibrium 1. We've identified the market, we have our downward sloping demand curve, our upward sloping supply curve, and we have identified equilibrium prior to the events. Now, there's an increase in the number of buyers. Commercial buyers and residential buyers purchase more solar energy. That's going to ultimately increase demand, which drives up equilibrium price and increases equilibrium quantity. If this was the only event that have happened or occurred in the market, you would be finished. At the same time, however, we notice that there's been an improvement in technology. It said in the problem that engineers have increased the technological capabilities of the solar panels. Any increase in technology or improvement in technology will shift the supply curve to the right. An increase in supply will result in price dropping and quantity increasing. The question is, how will these two events ultimately impact the market for solar energy? Well, the increase in demand drove up price and drove up quantity. The increase in supply drove down price and drove up quantity. Therefore, we know that the final results, a supply increase combined with a demand increase, price in this case is indeterminate. Quantity most definitely increases. Final problem. This one is a bit tricky. Threw you a bit of a curveball here. We will walk through it piece by piece. It says, assume the market price of wheat is $3 per bushel. However, the United States government decides to implement a price floor of $4 per bushel. What will be the effect of this price floor? What are the intended consequences of the price floor? How will the government intervention in markets affect market efficiency? This graph represents the efficient market outcome without government intervention. Downward sloping demand curve represents all of the buyers in this market, all of the individuals and groups who are willing and able to purchase wheat at a series of prices specified amount of time. The supply curve represents all of the wheat farmers, the sellers of this particular agricultural product. P1, in the problem it said that the price of wheat is $3 per bushel. So P1 would be $3 per bushel, and Q1 would be literally millions and millions of bushels of wheat bought and sold, purchased every week. According to Adam Smith and the rationing function of prices and the invisible hand, this is the most efficient market outcome. Buyers have determined that the marginal benefit of consuming this agricultural product is just about equal to the marginal cost of any other alternative means of spending their income. This is also efficient for the market outcome because quantity represents the allocatively efficient quantity where society has determined this is the proper mix of this particular product which maximizes society's happiness or satisfaction. Therefore, allocative efficiency is achieved. Likewise, productive efficiency is achieved because producers in the long run will be forced to adopt the least cost method of production to compete in this market. What about P2? In the problem, it tells you that the equilibrium price in the market is $3 per bushel. It also tells you that the government sets an artificial price, a price floor above the equilibrium price of $3 per bushel. So P2 would be $4 per bushel, the government set price floor. If the government did not intervene in this market, $4 per bushel would not persist as a price for wheat. Why not? Because what's going on at P2 in terms of buyers and sellers? If we look at P2 Q1, at $4 per bushel, buyers are willing and able to purchase only Q1 level of output. However, sellers are much happier at P2 at $4 per bushel. They are willing and able to make available for sale Q2 level of output. Now, the difference between Q1 and Q2 is excess supply or a market surplus. Again, according to market economics, the invisible hand, rationing function of prices, this is an inefficient outcome. Why would the government intervene and set a price floor, a price above the equilibrium price? In this particular instance, the government is attempting to assist the seller by keeping price above the equilibrium efficient market outcome. Sellers now receive $4 for every bushel of wheat they produce and sell as opposed to $3. The reason for agricultural price floors is to ensure adequate wages for farmers and to ensure for the entire nation a safe and reliable food source. Agricultural subsidies are one of the most debated economic topics for the last 20 or 30 years. They have their roots in the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. However, a detailed examination of that particular question involves much more time. For now, suffice it to say that any price above the equilibrium price, in this case P1, $3 per bushel, is inefficient for society. Why is it inefficient? The final part of this question asks, how will the government set price floor ultimately affect market efficiency? If we look down bottom again on the quantity axis, at equilibrium P1, there's Q3 level of outputs. The new government set price floor increases output of wheat from Q3 to Q2. If you look at the difference between Q3 and Q2, that represents, in terms of economics, dead weight loss, inefficiency. Too many resources are being allocated towards the production of this particular product. Society has determined that any use of resources to produce this product beyond Q3 is inefficient. So the government price floor is bad for society because we are over allocating economic resources to the production of this particular product.